some big questions that we encounter. Questions like, if you try to fail and you succeed, have you failed or succeeded? Questions like, if you go to the restaurant and you're waiting for the waiter, are you the waiter? Questions like, if you're a chicken farmer, does that make you literally a chicken tender? Questions like, why is the speed limit on Highway 4 65? Who are we kidding? Nobody goes 65 on Highway 4. Questions like, why do we press so hard on the remote when the batteries are dying? That doesn't make any sense. Questions like, how many Lowe's would Rob Lowe rob if Rob Lowe could rob Lowe's? There's a lot of questions that we face in this world, but some are deeper than others. Questions like, why is it that we seem to hurt the people that we love the most? Questions like, why does cancer seem to have such a grip on my family? Questions like, why can't I defeat this mental health disorder that I've been battling? Questions like, why does suffering exist in the world? Why is it that every 15 seconds a child under the age of 5 dies because of a preventable hunger-related cause? Questions like, when I pray about all those things, does God hear me? Does God even care? Is there even a God? Does God exist? See, this is the profound and fundamental question at the very bottom of every system of belief. Every person has struggled with this question to some extent or another. And maybe for you, the struggle has looked a little bit more like banishing that question far away from your mind because you don't want to think about it. Today, we're going to think about it. Today, we're going to talk about it. We're going to look at that question through a couple of lenses. See, I don't know if you guys realize this, but every person in the world sees the world through a lens of their belief, a lens of their experience, a lens of the things that shaped them growing up. We're going to look through a couple of lenses today as we answer this question, is there a God? It's also important to just note right now, some of what we're going to talk about today might feel a little bit like school. And there's some of you that got really excited when I said that, and there's some of you that got really terrified when I said that. But there's a few words today that might be unfamiliar. I'll do my best to make sure I define them, and if I don't define them, you can just raise your hand and ask. It's totally cool. But a few of the words that we're going to be using today frequently is when we're talking about these perspectives or these lenses we're looking through. The first one is the lens of atheism and materialism. So this lens, atheism and materialism, is a lens that says there is no God, and the material world, the stuff we can see, taste, and touch, that's what is. There's nothing other than that. All the things that we experience can be explained as we study the material world that is. Everything is matter and energy, dark matter and dark energy. Everything that exists in our world can be reduced to a measurement of one of those things. The other lens we're looking through is the lens of theism, the belief that God does exist. So notice they sound similar, theism and atheism. Atheism meaning no God, theism meaning there is a God. An important thing for us to also keep in mind as we go about this. I know oftentimes there can be, at least in my heart, kind of a straw man constructed of beliefs that are different from my own, where I have this version of someone else's belief that I keep in my mind because it's really easy to knock down, and then I feel really good about my belief. But nobody's really served by a straw man. Nobody's really served by knocking down a straw man, because if you've only beaten a poorly constructed version of another belief, well, that doesn't really say much about the belief that you have actually come to on your own. And I learned this lesson pretty early on. It's important to have conversations with those who disagree with you in a kind and respectful way, where you actually try to steel man the other person's perspective. You don't want to straw man, you want to steel man. If you're going to have a dialogue, understand where each other are coming from. I say that because there are some of you in this room who have been lifelong believers, who have been to church as long as you can remember. And I hope sincerely that there are people in this room for whom the question, is there a God, really still has that question mark at the end. Maybe you don't know, and maybe you hope there isn't. And I'm so glad you're here today. And I hope that today you would feel represented in our conversation. When I was young, I went to a dinosaur dig camp. I was really popular in middle school. So in 7th grade, I went to a dinosaur dig camp where we dug up dinosaur fossils in the Montana Badlands, plaster casted a triceratops skull in the middle of the plains and prepared it for exhibit at a museum. And the people that I went to that camp with had different beliefs from me. And the way that I went about discussions between our two belief systems came across a whole lot more like that than like anything resembling a conversation or kindness or love. And what that ended up in is making so few friends that I actually got forgotten and left at camp. This camp was 6 hours from my home and 30 minutes from the nearest town, and they accidentally forgot me. This was in the age before I ever had a cell phone. It was 95 degrees outside. I heard rattlesnakes going up and down the road. I had to follow a ranch dog 5 miles down the road until I eventually found a house that I could call the museum. It was wild, but I got myself into that situation because I was such a jerk in the way that I went about disagreeing. It's not just about being right, it's about the way that you're right and the way that you might be wrong. And so my hope today is that our questions are answered, not just because we shallowly touch on a few shallow things, but because we look in. For those of us in this room who are Christians, we would hope sincerely that a person who's here who's not a believer would sit, listen, examine, and maybe even be willing to change their belief. And if we walk into a room unwilling to ever do any of that, we miss an opportunity to feel seen and heard by them and for them to feel seen and heard by us as well. So we're going to put on those lenses today as we ask 3 questions. Number 1, what is existence? What's up with existence? Yeah, that's really simple. Number 2, what about beauty? And number 3, what about morality? These are 3 kind of playing fields for us to delve into this question, is there a God? So first, we're going to hop into what about existence? A simple question, easy to answer in about the 6 minutes I have allotted. What about existence? There's a wonderful guy named Sir Isaac Newton. He was a believer, actually. He's the guy who came up with the theory of gravity and amongst a few other things. And he came up with some theories about the world in which we live. There were some other theories as well that helped us to understand that our universe is a closed system, like this bottle. But somehow, at some point, stuff entered into that system. There's matter and energy, dark matter and dark energy, which if you've never heard of dark matter and dark energy, it makes up 90% of what exists, and it's super mysterious, and no one really knows all that much about it, but it's really wild. So anyway, that's fun. But our universe is a closed system, and stuff got in there somehow. But the question is how? When? How did all that stuff get in there? So let's look at this maybe through the lens of our atheist and materialist friend. Where did all of this stuff come from? A guy named Michael S. Turner, he's actually the guy who came up with the phrase dark energy, brilliant cosmologist. He says this: earlier than a microsecond, even protons and neutrons could not exist, and the universe was a soup of nature's basic building blocks. Quarks, leprechauns, no, that's not it, leptons, and the force carriers, photons, the W and Z bosons, and gluons. Is anybody lost yet? I know I am. I think gluons are the eyelashes that my wife wears. We could be confident that the quark soup existed because experiments at particle accelerators have recreated similar conditions here on Earth today. Now, part of why I'm sharing this is to help us see a fatal flaw in sometimes the Christian perspective of people who disagree with us. It's easy to assume that they don't know anything, and that's really, really, really mistaken of us. These are very, very intelligent people. who have studied for years a whole lot about our world and know a whole lot more in their field than I ever will. These are very brilliant people. And this is a guy who's taken so much time to study this that he has a whole vocabulary that I don't even resonate with. But here's the thing that I think we as Christians ought to be willing to give a little room on, which is this. In the world of the measurable, materialists do a really good job. In things that are measurable, they're really precise and authoritative and convincing in a lot of these sorts of things. Very smart. When you ask the question of how did the universe come to being and how did life itself come into being, the answer is essentially boiled down to this. There's a word called entropy. That essentially means the force of randomness, things that continue to move and change, entropy. And if you give entropy enough time, all sorts of reactions could occur, which theoretically could lead to life as we know it. With enough reactions and enough time, things could happen. That's essentially the baseline argumentation from a materialist perspective. And in theory, mathematically, it is possible. It's not impossible that things could have happened along those lines. I want to give credit where credit is due. These are brilliant, brilliant people. But here's something that I think, from the perspective of the theist, is worth exploring for those in the room that may not agree that there is a God. Romans 1, verse 20 says this, "For since the beginning of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being made known from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." Here's what that means. I can't go out and see a mountain and know that Jesus died for my sins, but I can go out and see a mountain and think to myself, that's been around a whole lot longer than I have. There might be other things that have been around a whole lot longer than I have. Whatever made that is big and old and really powerful and bigger than me. I think that's a universal experience that every single person can have as we experience the world around us. And this is why science is not the enemy. Science is an opportunity to reflect on nature as an image of God. He has put part of himself into his world. That's what Romans 1 tells us. That's why actually nature, we see the Bible as like the first book of God's revelation to us. Nature has often been referred to as God's second book. Like the way that God has allowed for us to see parts of himself is when we experience him in the world. It's a really beautiful thing. But you may have noticed in the quote from that very brilliant cosmologist, he never quite answered the question, where did all the stuff come from that fills up this bottle? He never quite got there. He said about the milliseconds after the Big Bang, but he didn't say how the stuff actually got there in the first place. And this is actually the biggest struggle for a materialist person. If this is the way in which you see the world, the reality is you're sitting somewhere inside this closed system trying to measure things that might exist outside of it. It's really hard to do. You can't measure the stuff that exists outside. You can't measure the stuff that's immeasurable. And so often what happens for the materialist and the atheist is they assume that there is nothing outside because they can't measure it. But in my perspective, from a theist perspective, that's a flawed argument. I think that theism, pardon me, presents us with the opportunity to see that there may have been something or someone that put the stuff that we have into the system that we are all in. And we look at our world and we see its complexity. When we say complexity, I mean complexity. When we say that the world is incredibly precise, I mean incredibly precise. Check out these numbers that are on the screens on the side. These are really, really incredible numbers. Let's go ahead and put those up. So these are big words, but we're just going to look at the numbers for a second. Where it says 1 in 10 to the 34th, that means that that's a number that starts with a 1 and has 34 zeros at the end of it. So a million has 6 zeros. This number has 34 zeros. 1 in 10 to the 37th, that has 37 zeros. 10 to the 120th, that has 120 zeros. Those are big numbers. If any of these particular aspects of our universe shifted by 1 in, whatever that next number is, 1 in 10 to the 120th, our universe would not exist. The probability of all of these happening at the same time, you multiply them together to find the probability of all of them happening at the same time. So if you want to know the probability of our universe being how it exists today, multiply all those numbers together and get back to me. It's diminishingly rare. In theory, the materialist could say, given enough time and entropy, it could have happened. And in theory, they're right. But they're the scientists stuck in the bottle, unable to measure the stuff outside. And that's the difficulty. That's the fatal flaw of the materialist perspective, is it's unwilling to look at what might be outside here. This scientist actually goes on to say this. He says that the multiverse might actually be the answer for how our universe came into being. All that matter and energy, well, it just came from another universe that's connected to our own. And he says the idea of the multiverse provides novel answers to two of the biggest questions in all of science. What happened before the Big Bang? And why the laws of physics are as they are. Cosmologists have mixed feelings about the multiverse. If the disconnected subuniverses are truly incommunicado, we cannot hope to test their existence. They seem to lie beyond the realm of science. So that's the answer? Like, the best scientific answer to where did all this stuff come from is, that lies beyond the realm of science. And I say that not to cast any sort of judgment because we're in the same place. The theist also says the answer lies outside of the measurable stuff. But if we're landing at ultimately the same place, it's not that big of a logical leap to say, could have been the multiverse, could have been God. They're logically sitting right on par with each other. And if the logic of the existence of a God has been a struggle for you to overcome in your belief in his existence, I just want to ask you, is it that much of a big leap from this perspective here? See, I would say that rather than a multiverse being the thing that kicked it off, I think that the reason that there's stuff in the bottle is because somebody put it there, because somebody wanted to. I think that the reason why the world exists in the way that we see it is because God wanted a smoothie. And apparently I didn't work at Jamba Juice, you guys. But you know what? God wanted something beautiful, and so he made it. God knew what he wanted, and so he made it. The answer, the mysterious answer that lies at the bottom of all our questions, like what's up with the universe? God wanted to. God wanted to make it. You know, one of the things that the atheists and the materialists will pin on Christianity, and this is actually a fair pushback, is they'll say, you just believe in a God of the gaps. Wherever you can't explain something, you just weasel God in there and say, oh, well, God did it. Who was it that moved the TV remote? I don't know, God did it. Who is it? You know, like when you can't find the answer, you just say, oh, well, God did it. But this isn't a God of the gaps theory. It's a God of a whole story theory. This isn't just putting on the theist lenses for a half second whenever I don't know the answer to something. I'm looking through this thing for the rest of my life. And I see a cohesive story about God's presence in our world. And I'm convinced that we see order in the world because God is a God of order. God is a God who brings order out of chaos. And see, this is where the trek for the materialist and the atheist begins to go a little bit uphill. As we transition to our next two topics of beauty and morality, these are things that in our experience of them, they defy measurement. Think about the cute little girl in the Iron Man movie who says, I love you 3,000. It's really cute and really nonsensical. I love you 3,000? 3,000 what? I can't. 3,000 inches, 3,000 liquid cups, I don't know, 3,000 Fahrenheit, I'm not sure. 3,000 what? You can't measure it. And from the materialist perspective of life, if just it's all atoms, maybe all these things that I experience really are just 3 pounds of electrified meat, pretending that I'm experiencing something when really it's all just chemistry. And could that be true? In theory, yes, but it feels like there's more. It feels like that's kind of a cheapened version of what my real experience is. And if you're a materialist, you might say, so what? Since when were feelings a scientific argument? Well, if there really is a God, if there really are things out there that are immeasurable, we should expect to feel that just a scientific measurement isn't enough to describe our experience of the world. If the immeasurable exists, there might be things that are hard to measure. I think that in itself is an argument for the existence of a God. But what about beauty? Let's think about beauty for a moment. I think one of the strengths in the atheist and materialist perspective is poking some holes in broad assumptions that theists like myself may have. And one of the holes that they poke is they would say, just because something appears to have design doesn't mean it was designed. So here's what I mean. Go ahead and put up this first picture. Just because things appear to have been designed doesn't mean they were designed. These are just hot Cheetos. That's all they are. They're just 4 hot Cheetos. Just because things appear to have been designed doesn't mean they were. Go ahead and go to the next one. So when I look at this, I see a lake with rocks and tall pine trees fading out into the mist. You know what this actually is? I was camping 2 years ago, and I drank some really gritty coffee. And when I got down to my last sip, I looked into the bottom of the mug, and this was there. It's literally just coffee silt at the bottom of my cup. The appearance of design doesn't mean it was designed. That's actually a pretty good argument. It's a pretty logical argument. It's something for us to actually think about, They would also say when you look at beauty in nature, the argument would be that natural processes made beauty advantageous. So if you're a peacock and you have beautiful tail feathers, you're more likely to have a peahen want to mate with you, have more eggs, and pass on your DNA to the next generation, okay? So the peacocks that have the best tail feathers are the ones that are going to continue to pass on their DNA. So beauty translates to being best for their survival. That's also a fairly compelling argument. What about things like the way that we feel about experiences that we have? For instance, when I eat a really good food, I feel good inside. Or when I hug my family, I feel a sense of bondedness and togetherness. What a materialist or an atheist might say is that these are nature's and evolution's way of getting us to do things that are most beneficial for us, to bond with family units, to seek out food that will be packing in the calories as quickly as possible. So thank you, donuts, for tasting so delicious. Wish that wasn't the case. But here's what I see when I look at the world through a theist perspective. I see things like the human eye. This is genuinely the most complex piece of technology that we have. Apple hasn't beat it. Samsung hasn't beat it. Tesla hasn't beat it. The human eye has 2 million working parts. When you are developing in your mother's womb, there's about 1 million nerve endings in your eye that meet 1 million nerve endings from your brain and meet in the middle. And they have to pair off precisely 1 for 1 with each other. And if anything goes wrong, you can't see. The chances of that happening are also diminishingly small. But many of us in this room see quite clearly. What a gift. You could maybe convince me about that whole thing about feelings just being an adaptation, that maybe I only feel good because it's evolution's way of programming me to do things that are best for me. You can maybe convince me that romantic love is, just conditioning me to pass on my DNA to future generations, or that fear is conditioning me to run away from the bear that's chasing me. But what about awe? What does like the sense of awe point to? If romantic love is conditioning me to draw close to a partner, if fear is conditioning me to run from a threat, what does awe point to? Where did that come from if every emotion and feeling I have is just conditioned naturally? But yet we experience it, don't we? Let's go ahead and put up this background for a moment. When I draw into nature, I have a sense of awe. When I look at the works of his hands, I see a God that breathed the stars out of his mouth. It makes me feel something. When I enter into spaces like this, I feel small in the best way. Reminds me of something. It makes me feel like I'm at home in something that transcends me. And it can be a startling feeling and a comforting feeling all at once. Where did that come from? What does that point to? I don't think it was an accident. I don't think it's an accident that every people group, every culture has this sense of awe and wonder as we experience the world in which we live. What is it that awe might point to? I even think of a few other questions, like why does food taste so flavorful? If everything is just a natural process leading to something beneficial for me, it's entirely unnecessary to have any more than two flavors, good and bad. But I feel something when I eat an entire pack of Oreos. And I feel something afterward called deep shame. And why is it that we can see color? That wasn't really necessary. There's plenty of species that don't see color, but we can. I mean, why do I even have a body? That's a good question. If the purpose of existence is just passing on DNA, that's actually what Richard Dawkins, a pretty renowned atheist and materialist, would talk about in his book, The Selfish Gene, about how DNA's purpose is to just replicate itself. And this is why viruses, in his opinion, are the most elegant and efficient beings on the planet. They're like the peak of evolution because it's just pure DNA. A virus doesn't need a body. It doesn't have to carry around 200 and whatever pounds of meat and try to take in calories and all that stuff. It just is and reproduces. Me having a body is entirely unnecessary. But here I am. And here you are. Why is it that we're even conscious? Have you even thought about that? Like, how many other things out there aren't conscious? If I'm wrong about that, and everything else is conscious, I feel a lot worse for mowing the grass. There's so much that we can't explain in a satisfactory way if we only look from inside the bottle at the other stuff that's inside the bottle. But when we're willing to address life and admit there might be something outside of it, there might just be somebody out there pushing the buttons. Sorry, I'm just blending it more because I want to drink it later, just to be honest. There might just be something outside of it. That's the humble thing that theism suggests. In a world that sure seems like there's stuff that's hard to measure, maybe the answer is because there just is. I think the takeaway for this is that we see beauty and love because God is creative and relational. But what about morality? This is a tough one. This is a hard one because everybody struggles to answer the question, what is good? What is good? And as we approach this, the question we're not asking is, can I be good without God? Because I personally, and I imagine you have as well, I've met a lot of people who do not love God and are very kind. They're among the most selfless, giving people I have met. And I've also met profoundly self-centered, judgmental believers. I saw one in the mirror this morning. It's not the question of can I be good without God? It's what even is goodness? If God doesn't exist, can we even have such a thing as actually good or not good? So looking at it through the lens of the materialist or the atheist, if God doesn't exist, where does morality come from? Oftentimes, people with that perspective are forced into two positions. Position number one is this: moral relativism. Here's what this means. It means that morals are not a law or a fact. They're something that is relative to things outside of it. It's something that just depends on culture and society. So moral relativism. What moral relativism looks like is this. That thing that you did wasn't really truly good or bad based on an unchangeable law of good or bad. It's good or bad because society has determined it to be good or bad. And so we all work together, kind of collectively agreeing on the things that we all agree are good and all agree are bad. And if you do the thing that we all agree is bad, you'll probably feel bad about it. And if you do the thing we all agree is good, you'll probably feel good about it. But these senses of good and bad change over time and aren't actually tied down to anything real. So moral relativism. And there's some credit here. We see how things change over time. 50 years ago, I would have been standing up here wearing a suit and tie. And if I wore what I wore today 50 years ago, people would probably feel really offended. Whereas people only feel a tiny bit offended. But there are things that shift and change over time. It's a fair perspective, but it's a really difficult one to hold all the way down. Here's why. Could you look into the eyes of a mother whose 10-year-old was killed in a school shooting and say, I bet that sure seemed like it was bad to you? We all kind of agree for now that that was probably a bad thing to have happened. It's missing something. As Christians, we understand that the question of why does God allow suffering, that's a tough one for us to deal with. That's why we're taking a whole week to talk about it here in our series. It's coming up really shortly. But the materialist struggles even more with this question of why is there suffering and evil? Because if you can't actually admit that things really are bad and really are good, that there is a moral fabric to the universe that certain things violate, if you can't get there, your judgment of things that are evil is shallow because it's only evil for now because we all agree. But all it takes is someone powerful enough conquering us all and giving us a new morality that we all agree to, and then we're fine with something that we weren't fine with 10 minutes ago. And so what many people end up doing is adopting something called moral quasi-realism, where they would say, we're not ready to admit that morality is a law or that morality is a fact, but we see the good that happens in the world when we all agree about things. When we all agree what's good and what's bad, we tend to get along better. And so even though I don't believe that moral laws exist, I will choose to live as if they do. That's what moral quasi-realism does. And as a theist, I see an open door when I see people with that frame of reference. Because if you're willing to look at something as important as morality, the why behind the decisions that you make, and you're willing to say, I don't believe in it, but I'm willing to live as if it's true, friend, would you be willing to run the same experiment with God? You may not believe in him. You may really want to not believe in him. But would you try for a week, for a month? Put on the God goggles. Check out what life looks like through this lens and see if it might explain some things you've had a hard time explaining before. This is why the theist feels comfortable in the third position, which is moral realism. There are laws. of morality. There is good and there is bad. There are universal truths of things that ought not to be done. And what this allows us to do is to look at those of us in the room who have experienced abuse and pain, who have experienced the effects of cancer on your family, who have seen a relative die because something they took was tainted with fentanyl. And we can actually say to you, that was wrong. That was broken. Things weren't as they should be. You are right to feel a sense of loss because that was wrong. I can believe in a moral law because I can believe in a moral law giver. I can seek justice because God is just. Maybe as we've been talking about this, you've thought to yourself, maybe there's something here. Maybe there's something for me to explore, but I don't know the next step. So let me give you 4 next steps for you to take. Okay, the first step I'd like for you to take is this. Ask God, would you speak to me in a way that I can understand? Not all of us speak the same internal language, but God, would you speak to me in a way that I can understand? Secondly, sensitize yourself to beauty. There's a quote often misattributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's actually by a guy named Charles Kingsley. He says this, never lose an opportunity of seeing something beautiful. Beauty is God's handwriting. It's a wayside sacrament. Welcome it. In every fair face, every fair sky, every fair flower, and thank for it Him. That's beautiful. Sensitize yourself to beauty. Number 3, experiment with solitude, silence, and Sabbath. There are things that we miss when we are caught up in this. The aspects of life and experience that compel us to look upward are dulled when we're always looking down. So take a minute, take an afternoon, take a weekend, and just get away and just be. This is a spiritual practice. Silence, solitude, and Sabbath are things that Christians have done for thousands of years to remind ourselves that there's more than just me. And to actually sit with the thoughts that come and the feelings that come. And to allow ourselves to be in the presence of God. Finally, understand what it is that you're declining. What is it that I'm saying no to? If you're saying no to God, what is it that you're saying no to? See, this is where I'm breaking from just the theism and casting a narrower vision, a pinpointed precision vision to Jesus. God is not just existing. He wants to be known by us. He chose us. He wants us. He made this because He called it good. He put the stuff in there that He wanted to because He wanted to, because He called it good. It was for His enjoyment. God wants us. He wants relationship with us. So much so that not only did He reveal Himself through nature, He entered our world and lived among us. Because He understood something that you and I think, all to our core understand. Our best desires are twisted and turned towards our worst inclinations. I feel it every day. And this was a kind of life and existence that God wasn't content to just sit by and let us soak in until we breathed our last. And so He entered the world as a person. He lived a life. He died a death so that we could have eternal life, and He rose from the dead to prove to us that death is not the end. And friend, he's inviting you into that story. It's not a God of the gaps. It's not a God wherever we can't explain things. It's a God who is the source of explanation for all things. And he's inviting us into his story. He's inviting us to give him our yes. In just a moment, we're going to partake in something called communion. It's a symbol of the kind of relationship that God wants to have with us. Before we take that together, though, and before Pastor Ray comes up, I would like to provide an opportunity to respond right here and right now. If you feel like it is time to give God your yes, I want this to be a moment that you can take that next step. And here's what I mean by giving him your yes. By saying, yes, God, I need help. I can't do this on my own. God, yes, I believe that you exist and I want to know you too. And God, yes, I accept your direction over my life because the way things are going when I'm in charge, it's not satisfying me. So today, with every eye closed and every head bowed, we're just going to take a moment to reflect, to listen, and to pray. If you're in this room right now and you are ready to give God your yes, would you just put your hand up in the air as we prepare to pray together? Is there anyone in this room? I see your hand. Thank you. I see your hand. I see your hand. Would you just repeat after me, everybody in this room all together? Jesus, we thank you for your love. We thank you that you chose us. We thank you that you created us, that you've shown us yourself through the world you've made, through the beauty we experience, through the justice that you served. And God, thank you for the mercy that you've given to me. I ask that you would give me new life. Forgive me of the things I've done wrong. And lead me into a life worth living. I love you. I thank you. Help me to follow you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.